should like to thank Professor Chomsky for his very suggestive talk. He is willing to answer questions and end the discussion. Please direct your questions directly to him. Mr. Moravcik.
You have characterized the empiricist position at one point earlier in the paper, though not toward the end, I know, as making some a priori dogmatic assumptions. The goal is to get the number. There'll be very few of these mental operations which are between the input and the output, and as to the nature of these. And I just thought that although the traditional empiricists don't give this sort of justification, some contemporary ones like mine do. Namely, one could put a more charitable interpretation of the empiricists by saying that their attempt is governed by the criteria which are accepted in science, namely of simplicity and economy.
Yeah.
And I'm not now denying at all that you might be able to show that what they want to do won't do, but only that perhaps one could put a more charitable interpretation of what the empiricists try to do, in a sense that it becomes a matter of degrees rather than difference.
Yeah. Well, I think that is the kind of justification that's given, but it does seem to me that this concern for simplicity and economy is entirely out of place here. I mean, if you have a theory that works, you can raise the question whether there's a simpler theory. But if you haven't the ghost of an idea as to how something works, it's senseless to ask about the simplest assumptions that might lead to it. So although, the concern is quite laudable for simplicity, it just has nothing to do with this situation. I mean, it seems to me as if someone were to say, well, look, I'm studying physics and I really think there should be one elementary particle, and, it's sort of silly to worry about more or something.
Accusing the empiricists of making a priori assumptions, I would want to argue that his reasons for what he said, when he doesn't mind his they will be able to be priori. But Leibniz too, argues entirely a priori. And it seems entirely. If you wanted to blame the empiricists for being a priori, then it seems to be thoroughly unfair to blame the emphasis on them, when Locke's main argument against innate ideas was that Leibniz's a priori reasoning wouldn't do.
Well, I think Locke's argument against innate ideas was rather different. I mean, it was something about common consent and things of this sort, which had nothing to do with the whole notion. But I'm not so... It had nothing to do with the whole... Locke's argument was in terms of failure of common consent, the fact that children don't have them and that sort of thing. I mean, that was kind of... But that... Yeah.
That was an argument.
Yeah.
But an argument on which he, unfortunately, didn't spend enough time, although he laid great stress on it, was that Leibniz said that the supposition of innate ideas was necessary.
Right, to account for some facts. Yeah. Yeah.
Knowledge of universal truth.
Right. Yeah.
And Locke argued that it would be enough to show that it was not necessary.
Yeah.
To show that there was.
Yeah. Well, you see, that's again this question of economy. So there are two questions here. One is this question of economy. I mean, if Locke were able to show that on empiricist grounds one could explain the phenomena that Leibniz was concerned with. Of course, he was arguing not against Leibniz. That's the other way around. But if he had been able to show that, then one would say, yes, he developed a simpler, more economical theory, and by the usual criteria not. But he wasn't able to show that, I think.
I would like to ask you whether you think that Leibniz's reason was a good reason.
Yeah.
Is that one could never achieve knowledge of something universally true because the senses only give instances.
I think there's much to that, in fact. I think that there's got to be some sort of predisposition for some kind of formulation of truths in universal terms, or otherwise, clearly, they'd never be achieved.
But this, you realize, is a priori.
No, I don't think so.
Because it's inconceivable.
Well, if I'm wrong, then I'd like to see how it can happen. I mean, I think that Leibniz's Although, of course, I wouldn't.
I gave the answer.
Pardon? How? No. In fact, the empiricists accepted the view.
If I give you this numbers and ask you to go on, you're very confident you can go on. This doesn't mean to say that the rule was innate in you.
Unless you can give some way in which the rule was learned, it does.
Well, you're intelligent.
Oh, but that's no answer. I mean, you know, if you're intelligent, see that, just to say you're intelligent doesn't mean that you should have gone on from this data to this specific rule. There are millions of rules you could have gone to. Why did you go to one rule?
Millions of rules, indeed. So are there millions of rules in nature then?
No, I think there's one, or one class of rules, and that, look, this isn't an A. Look, if we suppose forget humans or anything else, if we see some object, a black box, such that when we put in it a small amount of information, it continues to give outputs in some specific direction. Okay, like if we put in it a sequence of integers and it continues in one specific direction instead of thousands of others, what could we assume except that it's something about the structure of this device that causes it to interpret this information in that way? And it seems to me roughly that even the empiricists, I mean certainly Hume at least, when he tried to turn to the question of how induction takes place, he came out directly and said, yes, it's an instinct, what else could it be? And I think that's true, but look, in so many words. But I'd like to come back a little bit to this question of whether Leibniz was justified. I mean, obviously I'm not going to defend his particular conclusions, but it seems to me that the pattern of argument that he suggests is quite reasonable. That is, he says, this is what is known, okay? This is the output of an acquisition device, what is known. Then he says, well, what kind of evidence do we have? Particulars. Okay, that's clear. And he says, can I invent a hypothesis about a processing device which would go from what is available to what is known? And that seems to me a very plausible way to approach the question. One answer that you might give is that what is known is innate. Another answer that you might try to give is that there's some technique for operating on this information to give this output. But until it's given, I don't see any reason to pay any attention to someone who claims that there is such a technique.
Well, few remarks concern any specific problems which you discuss, problems of not the knowledge of language. So this problem seems to be especially interesting, and I would like to have more opportunity of discussing them with you. But the question which I want to touch very briefly is of different nature. You started with distinguishing two different approaches to all these problems. You characterized one approach as rationalistic, was this the term which you used, and from explanation which you know, it follows that you include here both, let's say, Platonistic and Aristotelian approach, or what one calls sometimes idealistic approach, and on the other hand, empiristic approach. Where I happen to be such old-fashioned materialist, nominalism, therefore when I hear about this division, I anticipate that I certainly shall be on one side of the fence. It means I shall sympathize with those empiricists. And then I notice with surprise that as far as only critical statements were concerned, I found myself somehow in complete agreement with you. It means a somehow hostile approach toward what we call empiricism. As far as negative statements are concerned, not positive. And I realized later why. I think in a sense, empiricism in this last period has assumed very restricted, almost degenerated form. In life, in natural sciences, it has been reduced to operationalism. Well, the style of Bridgman and so on. In psychology, to behaviorism. But I don't think that actually empiricism implies either operationalist or behaviorist point of view in the theory of knowledge. Perhaps this division, perhaps the terms are not the essential parts. I would rather like such things as physicalism as opposed to abstractionism, or well, some other terms which a certain division which would not coincide exactly with views. The problem for me would be whether one could give an explanation of all this phenomena using, let's say in general, physicalist terms. Mm-hmm. And I am not convinced at all that it is impossible or that it is very difficult, because the statements made by contemporary empiricists, by the empirics, do not fit the reality.
Yes, I think the distinction that you're pointing to, which may even be, certainly one that is important, is what might be called the distinction between, let's say, a mentalist position, which would attribute all of these phenomena to some occult medium, and a physicalist position, which would say, no, it has a physiological base. But I think that this is a funny distinction in a way. That is, you see, whether one is let's take this problem of a language acquisition device. At the moment, given the present state of knowledge, it's quite pointless, I think, to ask about the physical mechanisms that might mediate certain kinds of abstract structures. They could be almost anything, we just have no information. So it seems to me the only way to approach the question is to say, okay, what conditions do these physical mechanisms have to meet? Well, maybe they have to meet I suggest maybe they have to meet the condition that they be a transformational grammar. Or maybe that's right, or maybe it's wrong. Maybe they have to meet the condition that concepts are defined not in terms of physical properties, but in terms of human action, let's say. Okay, again, now that assumption that, so this abstract discussion of the nature of mental processes certainly shouldn't be interpreted as committing itself to the belief that there is no physical realization of these processes. That is, in this sense, mentalism and mechanism are by no means opposed. They crop up at a historically different period. I mean, it seems to me at a certain stage of perceptual research, for example, it would be important to say the innate characteristics of perception are line, angle, shape, gestalt, and so on. Well, that's an abstract statement about the mind. Maybe at a later stage of physiological research, which perhaps with luck we're beginning to enter into, somebody can say yes, and when I stick this microelectrode in here, I get a response only when a line is going through the retina with a certain angle. So this dichotomy is a real one, but I don't think these two positions are opposed. They're sequential, really. Now, of course, the point is that they are accidentally identified. That is, it's true that the rational, Leibniz was a mentalist also in the sense which I wouldn't want to accept, but that's the thing that seems to me accidental. That is, I don't see why from his rationalistic position about acquisition of knowledge, which attributed it to abstract conditions that are part of the structure of mind, I don't see that from that follows any anti-physicalist assumption. Though from that does follow anti-empiricist assumptions, if empiricism means what was meant in that quote, namely that the block of marble doesn't have any veins, that it could take any shape as well as any other shape.
You said at one point that if you move past the stage of just describing grammars into the stage of justifying them, that is, you go on from the question, what is a grammar of the language, to the question, why is a grammar the way it is, to answer that. You have to look for the answer to that question, to the language acquisition device, and look things out. I don't see why you say that. But my question to begin an answer to the question, why is a grammar this way rather than another way, by pointing out that if it were otherwise, certain distinctions that we obviously need for certain purposes couldn't be made, certain ambiguities that might lead to conclusions couldn't be avoided, and things like that. How do you say I have to look at language?
Well, because I don't think, it seems to me that, you see, there is another sense of explanation, another way of explanation, and I think that the one that you're talking about would fit there, a sort of evolutionary explanation. I mean, namely, language is like this because it evolved this way, and it evolved this way because it's well adapted to ordinary situations and so on. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable, but that's not but you see, that doesn't answer the following question. How does the child who's faced with a certain amount of data arrive at the conclusion that's represented by this account of the knowledge of his language? That seems to me an explanation, there is no conflict between an explanation which says English is like this because 3 centuries ago it was some other way and the following historical change took place, and a statement which says the English that a particular child learns who doesn't know anything about the history and doesn't know anything about the function of language and so on and so forth, but just is faced with certain data. His English is like this. Why? Because he imposed a certain structure on it. So, I mean, I don't see, for example, how just as a child couldn't use historical evidence in order to construct the language, to invent. After all, a child has to invent his language. I mean, he's presented with a certain amount of data. he has to invent a language of which this data is somehow triggers or which is an instance. He doesn't know anything about the history. He doesn't know anything about the functions that language has to play. I mean, he doesn't know anything about the fact that the sentence, what did Mary see the boy walking to, shouldn't be ambiguous, let's say. In fact, this is not information that's available to him at all. What he's presented with is sentences used in certain situations. On the basis of a rather small presentation of this, he's got to say, this must be the underlying structure for this. I just don't see any direction to look for an answer to the question how he does it, except in some constraints that he imposes on the task to be performed.
I'd like to take exception with your last thing you're saying, which is the child is not going to know this sort of rule. The language is, after all, used in a social context, even if the child is learning too. And he very quickly should observe there's some ambiguity in the fact that he gets different social responses depending on how these things are operated.
Well, that may show him the existence of ambiguity, but why does it show, what I don't understand, and perhaps it would or perhaps it wouldn't, but how does it show him that these ambiguities should be resolved in this fashion? That's what I don't see.
I imagine that if it shows him the ambiguity, it also should show him which is the norm.
No, because
he will get more acceptable response through use of it.
I don't really quite follow, because the point is, we know intuitively the arrangement of ambiguities and non-ambiguities in this array of sentences without ever having seen them at all. Can't be because we found in social situations that they were reacted to differently. In fact, ambiguity in real life is pretty hard to come by. I mean, you have to invent cases. You know, and of course, in real situations, one is rarely aware of its existence. There's too much that forces you to interpret it one way or another. See, the point that I was trying to make with these examples is that since they are quite new, nobody's ever seen them, and so on and so forth, there must be something about our knowledge of the language that predicts the arrangement of ambiguities and unambiguities. It can't be anything about our training or our experience with such examples, because we've never seen them before. And even if we had seen them, there certainly would be nothing in the way in which we had seen them to indicate that they're ambiguous or unambiguous. Consequently, there's got to be some feature about our way of approaching language which gives us a characterization of language from which it follows that these things have such and such a structure. And I particularly wanted to take examples like I persuaded him to come versus I expected him to come to illustrate the fact that, that we really have very little occasion to even discover that there's any difference in interpretation. I mean, until you notice that when you replace the active with the passive, you get a different meaning, which is something that you might discover after working on language for a long time, you wouldn't discover in ordinary life. Until you notice this, you have no occasion for even imagining that there might be a difference of underlying structure.
Don't you think if you take just the word expect and the word persuade out of that context, that you should learn from totally different contexts that these generate different social situations?
Oh, they do, but I don't see how the difference in the situations in which they're used accounts for the fact that I persuaded him to be examined by the doctor is not synonymous with I persuaded the doctor to examine him, whereas I expected him to be examined by the doctor is synonymous with I expected the doctor to examine him. So of course they have different meanings and everything else, but I don't see how from that fact follows this difference in every case.
Two things. One of the things what you've been saying commits you to something like the following. That when the child at home, for example, learns what a table is, the table in that particular home, that when you recognize a table in the place of living a queen and a table is of this kind, he therefore must have something like an idea of what a table is. Because obviously he hasn't what that table before. So you have to give some sort of account of how it is that a child can general way. Anyway, it turns out things like that.
No, I didn't say that, and neither did Leibniz, in fact. See, look, the force of that quote was that innate ideas are like the veins in the marble. You have to labor to find them. I think from the fact that a child develops a concept of table and can recognize different tables, it follows that he had some sort of a predisposition to interpret evidence that was presented to him in one way and not in some other way, which would have been consistent with that evidence. Well, one can make a strong claim and say, okay, the innate idea was a table. That's undoubtedly too strong. That's why I suggest abstract universals rather than substantive ones. So it seems to me there have to be, all that one can suppose is that there's some condition on the formation of concepts that leads him to interpret the little scattered evidence he gets in favor of the assumption that the table is something to be done.
Well, the other thing is this. In this case here, Mary solved avoidance station and so on. Why couldn't someone say this? Your explanation here tonight shows us what counts or what constitutes ambiguity in particular sentences which are not used in a particular context. From that, nothing follows by anything we can call the mind or the mind.
I don't follow you. Let me try to restate. I didn't understand, but let me try to restate what I did say and see if we're in conflict here. I mean, what I'm saying is that part of our intuitive knowledge of language, which can be drawn out by appropriate discussion, is that one of these sentences is ambiguous and the other two are not. Another part of our intuitive knowledge of the language is that when we form a question from the ambiguous one, it becomes unambiguous in a very specific way. Now, these are just facts, and I want to look for an explanation of them. Okay, one possible explanation is that your grammar is of this peculiar sort and that you're applying this linguistic universal that says permutation transformations can't be iterated. Now, and I might propose that as an innate idea in a Leibnizian sense, that if you have a predisposition to develop a grammar of this sort. Okay, somebody, an empiricist, could come along and say, no, I can explain how that was learned. Well, I just don't believe it. And if you can't, let them show it. That's all I'm saying.
Well, why couldn't one say simply something like this, that your explanation here tonight constitutes learning?
Well, I certainly didn't teach you that tonight.
Didn't you? I mean, what you're claiming is that we recognize this and that you have drawn this from us, this recognition.
Oh, yeah, but look, I mean, I think if I had said something different, if I'd said this one is ambiguous and these are not, I should think I would have gotten howls of opposition. I mean, I wasn't teaching you some new facts about English. Just pointing upon, just showing some peculiar arrangement of things which shows you what your own knowledge of English really is, quite before these items were presented. I wasn't making some sort of random remark about English and trying to force you to believe it or something, but to say, look, if you think about your own knowledge of English, this is what it predicts. So I don't see how that could be thought of as teaching. I mean, what's being taught perhaps is, that's a matter of fact. It's got nothing to say about it.
Maybe I'm not sort of getting this right, but then wouldn't this be a parallel to what you could say? If I write on the board the sentence, I hereby undertake to pay you $122.32 in the following days under some promise, which nobody's ever made before. And this is what the fact that I recognize that promise as being a promise, as constituting a promise, will show that it must have something, some mechanism by which I can use the promise.
Yeah, that shows that you have a concept of promise, and then comes the question. See, look, this fact shows that you have a concept of promise. That means it shows that the device which represents you, which took some sort of data and ended up with some sort of system of beliefs or something, ended up with a system in which the notion promise is represented somehow. But only after that fact comes the question about innate ideas, namely, how did this concept of promise arise? Was there a way in which it could have been taught? Is there any way in which it could have, given that our systematization of interrelations among people and so on is such that the concept promise plays a role, is there any way in which how could we have acquired that concept? And here there are two extreme positions that might be maintained and a lot of things in between. One extreme position would say promise is just an innate idea. That is, that such and such an interrelation among people should get a name that's predisposition of the mind. That seems to me pretty plausible, in particular if it turned out to be universal. On the other hand, someone might argue, no, this isn't the case. It could have developed through training, but then the burden of proof is really on him to show that. I mean, I don't see any reason to assume it. Exactly as if we were studying a black box and not a person, Exactly the same. It seems to me we ought to take exactly the same attitude. There is no a priori reason to make any assumption about how much initial structure there is. Well.
Professor Adams, I think we should have only room for 2 or 3 more questions.
I would like to ask in what sense it is that something is explained. If you point out to us that we are able to recognize these peculiar features of our language, And then you make the claim that we are able to do this, and we are able to do this because we have the capacity to be able to do this. And I don't see how it is that anything.
Well, if that was all that was said, certainly nothing would be explained. I mean, to simply say you know what you know because you have capacity to learn it is not an explanation. That's just the beginning. But wait, I didn't stop there, really. See, look, I was suggesting an explanation, which is not of that sort. Namely, the permutation that your knowledge of language is represented by abstract operations of a certain sort and that certain types of them can't be iterated. Now, that's not maybe wrong, but it's not empty.
Which, of course, is about the inscription of
About what?
well, about the vocabulary, about the sentences. In other words, you can talk about phrases and clauses and things like this without bringing in psychological.
Look, let's first forget about the question of psychological and think about the question of explanation. Here is a phenomenon, okay? I'm saying, how could we explain it? Well, the only way of explaining it is by setting up some deeper assumption from which it would follow, okay? Now, the deeper assumption in question, right or wrong, but certainly not empty, is that there are operations of this abstract sort and they can't be iterated. Now comes the psychological question. How did that deeper assumption ever get into your head? Well, it seems to me plausible to assume that it's just part of the way in which you approach language learning, and until somebody can show otherwise, I think that's the natural assumption to make. Because it's inconceivable that such an abstract concept could ever be invented by anyone on the basis of evidence, I think.
Mrs. Walters?
I'd like to make a suggestion that with all your remarks about Wittgenstein, you bypassed Wittgenstein when you began with your diagram about the processing device. And your talk about how this device works and what things are in it is very reminiscent of 18th century philosophy.
It's meant to
Locking, certainly, the furniture of the mind. You know? But this is not the way Wittgenstein thought at all, and nothing you said surprisingly even touches him, because what he said was, in order to understand what this processing device is doing when it's using language, you ought to look at what other things it does. It's not a processing device, essentially. It's something else. It's not a cat in a laboratory. It's something doing things, and doing things conjointly with other processing devices, which really aren't processing devices, but they're doing things and building things. And this was the whole point of the beginning business investigations. There was a use for language within a larger context, and that context was not a mechanical context. But I mean, why can't someone say, well, the veins in the marble are among the veins in the marble are the fact that people have two hands.
Well, certainly says it.
There are also other things. They're sociable and they.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. But look, as far as the Wittgenstein thing is concerned, I gave that quote particularly to indicate that I'm not talking about his interest. I mean, he says, I am not interested in hypothetical mechanisms of mind, I'm interested in some other question. Okay, fine. I just conclude from that he's not going to have anything to say about the other topics he does talk about. And look, as far as the other thing was concerned...
How your distinction between empiricists and non-empiricists even applies.
Well, no, that wasn't meant to apply. I think what applies to Wittgenstein is his comment that, so we're going to give you a page reference, if you like, that language is taught only by drill and by explicit explanation. I mean, he says that in so many words, and what's more, that's consistent with his general view.
But I simply, it really isn't.
Well, but he says it. Okay, we don't have to argue about whether it's consistent, but it's clear that he said it right in about the 10th page of the Blue Books or so. I mean, he says there are two ways of learning language. One is drill, the other is by the use, I forget his phrase, something like the use of rules, and he says by that I mean explicit presentation of rules which are present if you write down above the act as you carry them out and so on and so forth.
Well, let me make one more point, and that is his notion of explanation, explaining a rule, would be utterly different from yours because of this beginning, the way he begins,
Yeah.
the context in which he need language to be working.
I don't think he. Yeah.
The fundamental or the essential ground of the rule, if he would ever use it, would have something to do with the way of life. And this is, I think, what he
Yeah, but that just, okay, that But look, I don't believe that he ever attempted to give or succeeded in giving any explanation for rules. I mean, he just said, look, this is the way it is. I mean, a person says 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, therefore he knows the rule, and is there anything more to say? Well, there isn't anything more to say if you're not curious, but if you want to know why, there's a lot more to ask, certainly.
One final question.
Why, in your mind, does the burden of proof lie on the man who was developed?
I can't hear you, sorry.
Why, in your mind, does the burden of proof lie on the man who wants to develop language out of experience than on the man who says that there are, innate ideas and yet has no specific way of going from the gene to the speech of the child?
Well, I think there's a clear reason for that. Look, the person who believes in that experience does it, and the person who believes that it's part of the structure of the mind, each of them is in the same position with respect to the physical mechanism. That is, there's no known physical mechanism for learning, and there's no known physical mechanism for underlying structure. So as far as physical basis is concerned, they're in the same position. Therefore, I think that question can be excluded. The point is that we can, I think, make assumptions about innate ideas like this one, from which some things follow about language. And I don't think we can say anything about experience, about use of experience from which things follow about language. So the reason why I think the burden of proof is on the empiricist is that the rationalist has a theory, which has some consequences, some of which seem all right, whereas the empiricist has nothing other than assumptions about how the theory must look. And that's the argument I'm trying to make. And you see, as far as physical realization is concerned, neither of them has anything to say at all, really. Nobody knows what learning is physiologically or initial structure.
Well, I think Professor Chomsky is now entitled to some rest.